Thank you for being here. We are here today at this Chronogram conversation to chat following up our July issue of Chronogram, which featured "The Future is Now Toward a Better New Normal." I am Brian Mahoney. I am the editor of Chronogram, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's panel discussion. Some housekeeping notes before we get started. First, I will note that this is a Zoom conference line. As many of you undoubtedly know, Zoom has had some problems with security and Zoom bombing. So I have developed a two-pronged strategy to deal with that. One, if we do get Zoom bombed, I'm going to ask us all to sing "Row, Row, Row Your Boat" in the round until the bombers retreat in fear of our vocal solidarity. Okay? Two, let's assume this is not a secure line. I advise you not to type your social security number, bank account information, or trade secrets into the chat window. What the chat window is good for is for posting any questions you may have, as well as any comments or resources you wish to share with the group. Please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat window at any time. When you join the call, you are automatically placed on mute with the video turned off. If you have any questions, I ask you to type them in the chat window, and then I will triage them and share them with the panel. I ask all panelists to keep themselves muted as well when not speaking. This Zoom call is being recorded. If you are uncomfortable with that, I get it, me too. But I've taken a "how I learned to stop worrying and love the constant surveillance" approach. So you can leave or stay. A recording of this meeting along with a synopsis of the conversation will be posted on chronogram.com sometime next week. A note on this afternoon's format. Once I'm done talking, Melissa Everett, Executive Director of Sustainable Hudson Valley, will say a few words. Then Melissa and I will ask some questions of the panelists before we open it up to audience questions. Tonight's conversation is not designed to be a deep dive into any of these topics, but a jumping off point for further discussion and collaboration. A little self-promotion now. Subscriptions to Chronogram are available for $36 a year or $5 an issue. You could, right now, get this for $5. We'd mail it to you. Or some people, I drive it to their homes. You know who you are. That sometimes happens. Only when we're very late to the post office and they want to charge us an arm and a leg. We go out and we drive subscriptions around. But more than that, you can get all of these things at chronogram.com, Chronogram Media /delivery. Then you get the magazine mailed to your house and you won't have to fight over the last copy in the vestibule of Adams Ferry Farms ever again. And as I speak right now, our drivers are fanning out with the August issue. Here it is. I unloaded the truck merely an hour ago. Milton Glaser. We have a tribute to Milton, who lived part-time in Woodstock for many, many years. Beautiful cover. A photo by Franco Vo. Shout out to Franco. He did an amazing job shooting Milton. This is from, I believe, 2014. You can get this. We'll mail it to you. Just go to Chronogram Media /delivery and we'll mail it to you. $5. We'll mail it to you. Okay. What else can I tell you? Oh, we moved. In case you want to come visit us, we're not uptown anymore. We're in Midtown at the Fuller Building, 145 Pine Grove Avenue. Wear a mask. Thank you. People keep coming in. Okay. A note on how the issue came about. The pandemic hit in mid-March, and then by early April, we had settled uncomfortably into it. And, ennui was as much a source of anxiety as a fear of contagion was. But like many others, we were thinking about this unparalleled disruption and how it made an opening for a challenge to the dominant paradigm. The world was cracking open, and, once sacred shibboleths were looking as shaky as pizza in an earthquake. And so we felt there was a chance that this crack in the facade might give way to a new reality. So I said, what do we do now? I called Melissa Everett at Sustainable Hudson Valley, who thankfully agreed to be a co-editor with me on this section. With her help, we put together a 30-page magazine within a magazine that features 6 interrelated themes: health, economy, food and agriculture, public space, education, and social justice. And it was tackled by writers and strategic thinkers, some of whom are with us today on the panel. I want to thank Melissa for helping put this together, my colleagues at the River Newsroom who are also involved in this project. And if you're not familiar with the River Newsroom, it is our recent-ish, we've been at it for 2 years now, journalism, regional journalism initiative, and you should go to therivernewsroom.com and see what we're doing there and become a subscriber and support that project, because Philip Pantuso and Lissa Harris, who run that, are doing amazing work, and they've covered the hell out of the pandemic thus far. So thanks to them, thanks to all the wonderful contributors who contributed to the Future is Now package, today's panelists, thank you for being with us, and the rest of the staff here at Chronogram Media who are immeasurably helpful, especially a shout out to our creative director, David Perry, who makes everything work visually no matter what I throw at him. One more thing before I throw it over to Melissa. I got an email from a subscriber just this morning offering praise for the July issue, which he had just finished reading. I just want to share part of his note to me, which I think captures what we were trying to do with The Future Is Now. And I quote, "Your decision to see our situation as a whole mirrored the training I was taking last week to join Al Gore's Climate Reality Leadership Corps. The bottom line message of these intense 9 days was to personalize and internalize all of it. COVID, climate change, the death wail of fossil fuels and rise of renewables, the sclerosis of the American soul, and its promise of recovery in the symbol of hope that Black Lives Matter has become. All of it together taken as a single, intense experience handled head on. The Gore campaign had a clever little trick that made the training personable and shareable for the 11,000 of us caught up in the glare of the possible last week. Write your own story," Al said, "and use that to personalize these various abstractions, for after all, they affect us each and every day. Make them real and use that to fix/change the world. I am finding a new voice through my story. Chronogram just did it too, and your story is the region's, and that tells me that the inspiring story of a future that can survive, and one with a good ending in which we fix it all, and that we are starting to do it. The hope bomb is starting to explode." The hope bomb is starting to explode. I love that. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Melissa to talk about this exploding bomb of hope.
Okay, thank you all. And it's great to see everybody. And would you check the waiting room, because someone just emailed me. She was trying to get in. We don't want to look too smooth here. When the first wave of event cancellations and shutdowns took place back in March, one of my board members, who I know is on this call, shared a one-liner. Mother Nature called. She says, "Go to your room." And I think we're still making the necessary changes in our routines and expectations to fight the pandemic, but seeking at the same time ways to take action that's responsible, meaningful, and useful. Just briefly, Sustainable Hudson Valley's focus is the climate crisis, which has not let up in spite of humanity's understandable preoccupations. Our mission is to speed up, scale up, jazz up, and leverage progress against climate change and create communities where people and nature thrive. And that means all people. So we are in the midst of reimagining our work in light of the interwoven crises that are so clear now of climate, COVID, economy, and justice. These crises are connected at their roots. A polluted environment and unhealthy ecosystems feed climate change and create the conditions for pandemics. The public health crisis and the economic whiplash that it has triggered are felt most by people who are already suffering, whether from poverty or racial violence or limited access to resources. And there's an underlying consciousness that feeds all these crises that some of us can extract and exploit and oppress to benefit our own quality of life without paying attention to the impacts. Our lives are connected by the collective trauma of these times. But as Brian said, they're connected too by the choices before us, choices to do things differently and create a better new normal. Greta Thunberg, the young climate leader, has been cautioning us all not to throw the word opportunity around casually, because we are in the midst of a tragedy. But there is a call to action here. Our habit structures have been disrupted. We have daily decisions to make. We have decisions as communities about priorities. We need to reboot the economy. We need to care for public health and civil society. We need to imagine new ways of living and working. There have been a lot of conversations on these topics, and I think necessarily because we're all trying to make sense of it so intensely. And I know those of you who I know, and everyone in the Chronogram network who is gathered here, I know we are seeking out meaning so that we can take action. Back to you, Brian.
Thank you, Melissa. So I'm going to ask questions of the panelists, and Pamela, I'm going to go to you first. Pamela Boyce-Sims is an evolutionary culture designer who helps to build social transformation movements from the inside out. She founded Singularity Botanicals, a sociocratically governed business venture that addresses community resilience and self-care sovereignty through cultivation and distribution of medicinal plants and self-transformation practices. Pamela, thanks so much for being here with us. My question for you, your current project, Singularity Botanicals, came to our attention because it achieves so many objectives at once. It helps people reskill for good jobs and business ownership opportunities. It promotes self-care sovereignty and resilience, especially in communities of color. It creates healthy organizations through what you refer to as sociocratic governance, and it provides resources directly to help people withstand illness and toxins in their environment. How much can this kind of thinking be replicated in the growth of your business model and the creation of others like it?
Thank you, Brian. The short answer to that question is that this business model can be replicated if it is executed and supported by a community of like-minded people who are truly on the same wavelength. And by that, I mean people from any and all walks of life can make it work if they all understand that as businesses, as a society, as a country, as a global society, we're moving into completely uncertain, uncharted territory without a safety net in every domain of our lives. So anybody involved in this kind of business model needs to really get that we are abiding and learning how to thrive in a climate of complete groundlessness. That business organizations and networks that intend to thrive have to demonstrate and live into, not just intellectually understand, but need to shed outworn ways of relating internally as an organizational culture, as well as in their public-facing dealings. And that takes personal internal work on the part of everybody involved in the enterprise. So if you've got all of those pieces kind of humming in harmony, you've got a shot at replicating that. So that said, the boots on the ground aspect of what we do is all about environmental resilience building and moving towards self-sufficiency against the backdrop of climate change, resource depletion, and impending economic collapse. So therefore, our nonprofit plant medicine project works beside the most climate change vulnerable populations who are learning to grow their own herbal medicine, understand its effect on the body, and we also distribute plant medicine free of charge in severely depressed communities. Singularity Botanicals reaches out to networks of environmental and social change activists to involve them in the process of supporting the nonprofit operation through self-care membership. And that's a process whereby written material supported by plant medicine is offered to those who are on the front lines of activism to sustain their energy, to deal with chronic stress and depression and anxiety, even as their donations for that self-care material is funding the free plant medicine distribution in severely depressed communities.
And Pamela, you're based in Chester, PA, but you also are active in the Hudson Valley as well, correct?
Oh, very, very active in the Hudson, in New York generally, but we have 2 grow sites, one in Saugerties at the Underground Center, and another one that is at Seed Song Farm just outside of Kingston. We also have another New York herb grow site, which is up in the Finger Lakes district, up in Hector, New York. But yes, we have 2 grow sites there, and they're part of the constellation of projects that we have. And the constellation of projects is all held together in the framework of sociocracy, also known as dynamic governance, which is kind of like an ectoskeleton, a kind of flexible, adjustable, dynamic scaffolding that we use to create a living, breathing, aerated governance and decision-making process where the authority is distributed across the organizational network, applying subsidiarity, meaning everyone has the authority to decide what's best in their specialty domain because they know what's happening on the ground. Finally, the driving force, even behind sociocracy, which is a Quaker process-derived originally process, is and creates cohesion, is what we call community-supported enlightenment network. And that's a national network of participants on the plant medicine side of the business especially, that applies a confluence of ancient wisdom tradition practices, contemplative deep self-exploration practices with cutting-edge neuroscience technique that optimizes neuroplasticity of the brain to do the internal work necessary to build a culture for this, as well as skillful experiential navigation of the web of quantum interconnectedness, which is the worldview, the ethos that everybody brings to this. So in the final analysis, the underlying theme here is a shift in consciousness. That's really the driving force behind Singularity Botanicals, the plant medicine project, sociocracy as an ectoskeleton, realizing that it's only internal self-transformation that is going to truly drive impactful, long-haul business or organizational success as we move into total groundlessness. So, long answer to your question, but hopefully that covered the whole spectrum of that big piece you cut off there to explore.
Yes, I think you and I could we could spend a number of hours unpacking what you just said. So I appreciate that, and obviously, as I mentioned, we're just using this as a jumping off point. So thank you for sharing that, and I certainly.
Sure.
I certainly agree, and I think those of us who are involved in this work agree that there has to be a personal as well as a societal transformation to be had. So let me address my next question to Cynthia Nikitin. Cynthia has led numerous large-scale, multi-sectoral, place-based, community-driven projects and facilitated nearly 300 workshops and seminars during her 28 years with Project for Public Spaces and since. Cynthia's technical expertise stretches from the development of downtown master plans to the creation of corridor-wide transportation and land use strategies and the development of creative placemaking initiatives for safer and healthier cities. Cynthia contributed a piece to The Future Is Now on the possibilities of public space changing in this place we're finding ourselves in now. So Cynthia, for you, the pandemic has allowed us to view public space in a new way, and I'm going to quote the piece you wrote back to you. For the first time in 50 years, streets and roads, which account for 80 to 90% of the public space in many cities, are being turned into places for people, not cars. So post-pandemic, how do we ensure that this expansion of public space doesn't contract into our normal car-centric culture?
Great question. Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Melissa, and thank you, fellow panelists, for inviting me to be part of this really dynamic conversation. I'm going to say that these are all experiments that are happening in over 260 cities around the world. And the longer these experiments stay in place, the more likely they are to be made permanent, and the higher likelihood of being able to successfully measure metrics that demonstrate how effective they are. We talk about experiments. Everyone knows about the closing of Broadway, you know, from 59th Street, from Central Park, you know, all the way downtown. That was an experiment, and everything was kind of done with people bringing lawn chairs from their porch or their backyard or the basement in case they had to take it all out and let the cars come through because the world was going to end. That has not happened, and in fact, as we know, in New York City and other cities, these kinds of street closures have been made permanent. But the biggest experiment, which is another flip side of the answer, is the entire federal highway system, you know, where you build major highways with incredibly large suburban developments and office parks, and you don't do it in one place and test and evaluate like you do in a normal experiment. We did this everywhere at once, you know, in the 1950s after World War II, and we've been living with this failed experiment, you know, for over 50 years. So if that kind of a failed experiment can stay in place, good experiments, so will happen. With this placemaking and all of these things, everyone's always asking our funders, particularly, how do we measure the benefits? Well, we've started to see some benefits and improved air quality, reduced congestion, more people engaging in active transportation, which improves public health. And there are health benefits and health savings costs that can be calculated from people walking and biking and doing active recreation. So we can measure the fact that this is working. Another reason is money. Oh, baby. Little Cork, Ireland, my new favorite city in the world, is spending 2 million euros to create 4 kilometers of new cycle lanes in Cork. Okay, that's Cork, Ireland alone. That's only 4 kilometers. As I said, 260 cities are doing this. So if a city like Cork is spending 2 million euros, you think they're gonna take it back and let the cars come in? I mean, that would be like a waste of money, which would be hard to justify taking out all those cycle lanes and letting the cars come through again. So financially, for these cities making these investments, it really doesn't make sense to go back to the old way of doing it. But people need to speak up. They need to tell their local officials that they want these changes to stay and they want more of them. And that's either by voting or lobbying or just getting out and using these spaces, writing letters, but letting their local municipal officials know that they want this to happen so that when it comes before the planning board and they're ready to rip everything out, there's a vocal community that says, heck no, we won't go, we want this to stay. But really, and this is tying into some other things, it's really an issue of what Julian Eigenmann from Tufts University refers to as spatial justice and the democratization of streets. And that is what we are seeing, because democratized streets that have equal space for bikes or that prioritize the most vulnerable people on foot, then on bikes, then in transit, then in cars. These create enhanced livability, not only for the privileged residents who live on low traffic streets, but for low income people who live on heavily trafficked streets and who rely on public transportation, and walking is their only means to get around. So these street closures not only improve environmental quality, they improve human equality. So ways to make these permanent is you have to adopt new principles, like Eco District has 2 principles: make collaboration inescapable, and that's both sides of the coin, and build equity into every decision. And if you make a decision to remove the bike lanes and remove the outdoor dining and remove the public space for exhibitions and markets and selling goods and people providing an opportunity to actually make a living, that's an equity decision. And that's where we really have to focus. Thank you.
That's awesome. I love that. I think the idea of creating equity, tying that in with the public space, that makes total sense. And certainly I think that idea will reach some people in a powerful way, just above and beyond having more public space be public. All right, I'm going to move on to John Lyons. John wrote a piece on remote work for The Future Is Now. John is a transportation professional, sustainability leader, solar entrepreneur, and business developer with a passion to address the climate crisis and help create a clean energy future. John, because of the pandemic, remote work is a new normal for so many of us. Here we are, working remotely. Many predict that remote work will become the norm rather than an outlier after the pandemic. But remote work is not without pitfalls. How do we, employers, workers, a society, reap the most benefits from a future that will prominently feature remote work?
Thank you, Brian, for hosting, and thank you, Melissa, for all that you do. I really can't believe the number of articles that have been published out there about remote work and it already being the future. We need to slow that down a little bit. But Ben Franklin said, out of adversity comes opportunity. And I'll have to apologize to Greta, but we have a big opportunity here. So how do we make it happen? You know, what do we need to do? I think this is actually, and this is rare for me to say, but I think there's a great place for government to lead here by example within their employee base, but also by promoting and supporting remote work in all levels. There are two overarching themes with the companies that were successful with COVID in transitioning quickly as we had to. The best companies had policies already in place, policies and plans. Maybe they were emergency plans or business continuity plans, but they had plans in place that included working remotely. Those that didn't had to scramble and didn't do as well, and you know, not as good an experience. The second one was, and this is obvious, well-resourced organizations did much better than the small and medium companies. They had resources to adjust. So the challenges, along with those two overarching themes, the biggest challenge to transitioning is actually in management and trust. In a lot of the medium-sized and smaller companies, managers like to see their people and whatnot, and that's something we need to overcome, easily overcome. The other area is performance measures for remote working. It's just different. You can't see the person. Also, not so hard to solve. So government leading by example, learning from the private sector. We have a lot of Hudson Valley companies that have been doing this for a long, long time, IBM and MasterCard. Lots of experience here to share. The development of policies, I mentioned those that had them succeeded, those that didn't. That's an easy thing. We need to create some open access to best practices, plans, templates, tools, all of that stuff. And take it one step further and try to create an employer-to-employer mentoring program. I think the talent here is in the private sector, is in the companies that have already gone out and done this. And I think we can encourage them to share by recognizing their good programs and whatnot, but creating an opportunity for companies to learn from companies. Training, I mentioned the evaluation-based performance. You'd think it would be obvious. And some companies are along there, but not all. And managers are just uncomfortable at this point managing a remote workforce.
Yeah, you know, John, it was interesting. I'll just share something that we experienced here at Chronogram. We had a fairly diversified workforce, people who worked around the Hudson Valley, who came into the office maybe a couple days a week, but worked from home more than they worked in the office. So we were ready for the transition. What I didn't realize was we onboarded a couple of people in the midst of this. That was hard. They didn't have our culture. They didn't understand what our processes were. And there is something that was a stumbling block that we haven't actually figured out yet. Like, how do you inculcate a culture remotely to someone who's just starting new? And I think that's a question for organizations to figure out.
Brian, I don't think we have time right now, but culture is the key. And every culture is different. And we need to be sensitive that it's not a one-size-fits-all. And we don't tell people how to do it. It needs to be created from within.
Okay, more to come on that. All right, I'm gonna move over to Kwame Holmes. Kwame wrote a piece for the July issue, Why Abolish the Police? Because We Can Replace Them. Kwame is scholar in residence, at the Human Rights Project at Bard College, and a contributor to Kingston Resilience Group's Neighborhood Pods initiative. Kwame is also the director of the Kingston Housing Lab, which is in the process of collecting information on hundreds of properties in Midtown Kingston in an effort to study the hidden geography of property ownership in the city. This is a project that I'm actually personally really interested in. I've spoken with Kwame about. But Kwame, my question to you, in your essay, you wrote about how neighborhood pods could replace many of the functions traditionally handled by police. Can you explain a bit about this mutual aid model and how it's coming together in actuality here in Kingston?
Yeah, you know, the vast majority of times that the police are called, it's for nonviolent situations. And I'm including in that, you know, property crimes. And so when there's a nonviolent situation, the question has to be asked, why do people who have guns arrive on the scene? And particularly, why are people who have been trained to always imagine the possibility that they could be attacked arrive on the scene, right? So when it's a nonviolent situation, quite literally, the police introduce the element of violence into the situation. And that seems really strange to me, and I think to many other people who have witnessed some of the terrible consequences of that sort of background premise for policing, right? George Floyd and Breonna Taylor are only the most extreme illustrations of the consequences of that thinking. There are hundreds of thousands of incidents of police brutality that extend beyond that, of course. And so neighborhood pods is an opportunity to think about how can we recognize that we've actually authorized the police to behave in this fashion. We're not disembodied from them. We quietly authorize the police to introduce violence into a range of situations which are about harm and which are about repair, but don't actually require retribution through violence. And so because we authorize the police, we also have an obligation to produce different types of relationships within our neighborhoods and our communities that can solve the problem, right? But without a violent means. And so, for example, neighborhood pods are, well, for one thing, they're not only about policing, they're about all kinds of mutuality, right? That's ritualized and positive. But in the case of things where there's been harm, say someone's been robbed, or in the case of mental health services, neighborhood pods are about creating a self-directed culture to investigate the harm through like conversation, community roundtables, and to investigate what the person might actually need to feel repair. That could be the replacement of the item, right? And so the neighborhood could choose to collectively purchase the stolen object.
So if my lawnmower had been taken, I might come to the group and say, hey, my lawnmower's been taken.
Absolutely, yeah. Or if there's been vandalism, like let's repaint, right, this portion of the house together. Let's actually solve the harm rather than going through an administrative process of retribution. So how is that happening? We're just getting started, you know? Training people in this way is, reminding me of Pamela's work, is a profound internal management, right? It means confronting our desire to have someone else take care of the problem, and it means taking up the idea that there's a risk that we will still experience harm even if we choose not to engage in retribution and response. And being able to hold the risk of that is tough work. And so we are doing a series of meetings to train our pod leaders in nonviolent communication, and in having conversations about fear, just like basic, what am I afraid of? And to encourage people to read old school anarchism, because this is kind of basically that, just in a cuter version. So yeah.
Well, thanks for that. It's interesting. A couple themes are becoming clear to me throughout all of this, and it was clear to me as I was editing the section with Melissa, but external work is being done, but also internal work needs to be done. And this intense relocalization taking back to this, how do we get as local as possible? And so the pods speak to that, and then I think that sets up Hélène pretty well. Hélène contributed a piece on just transition to the FIN, The Future Is Now, and Hélène focuses on Hélène Lesterlin, I'm going to give you your full name, focuses on building a movement that leads to a regenerative economy and healthy social ecosystems. She currently serves as a worker trustee at the Good Work Institute, a nonprofit that fosters just transition in the Hudson Valley. Hélène, the Good Work Institute has embraced the just transition framework to advance systems of change based on 5 principles: advancing ecological restoration, democratizing communities, wealth, and the workplace, driving racial justice and social equity, relocalizing most production and consumption, retaining and restoring cultures and traditions. How are these principles put into practice? How does the theory translate into action?
Great, thank you so much. So the first thing I would say to that is that just transition needs to be understood in the context of its larger agenda, which is to give us a pathway to move from an extractive and unjust economic system towards a regenerative and just system that works for the well-being of all people and the planet. And by extractive, we mean a system that is based on the assumption that we can extract resources to create wealth and growth in perpetuity forever, right? But if the earth is understood as finite and bounded and even as a sacred space, then that assumption falls apart. And then if we also consider that extracting labor for profit, people's life force and passion for profit, it quickly becomes clear that it's an unjust and inhumane system over time. So just transition is a framework to start to imagine how do we make the leap into the unknown from our current system that seems so entrenched. And that can seem overwhelming, how entrenched it is. It's hard to even start to talk about it because then you start to say, well, this depends on that. But what I love about the just transition framework is that by articulating clearly the 5 areas that you just spoke to, it starts to break it down into something that we as individuals and as a community can use as a guide to building a new system. And what that looks like in action for Good Work Institute is that we use the Just Transition framework to empower people to create change in their communities, in their area of work, and in themselves, in their own personal lives. And I love that this internal-external thing has already come up because that's exactly how I want to frame it, that there's an internal process for each of us, and there's an external process, which is dismantling the old system by building a better system that works better for people and the planet. So I just want to quickly break down what I mean by internal and external from our perspective. So this internal work is acknowledging that oppression and habits of mind inside of us get reflected in the outside world, that we can't build a more just system without addressing our own internal blind spots and building up our own internal resources. So what we want to do is support each other in developing new skills and new habits that align with the vision of the future that we want to build. And so at Good Work Institute, that means that we help people foster skills in collaboration, in mindfulness, in nonviolent communication, which was just mentioned. We help people to dismantle white supremacy within ourselves. And we start to be more open to the possibility that we don't need to operate from a place of fear and scarcity. So again, similar to what was just stated, like, let's talk about what we're afraid of. Let's talk about why we think there's scarcity, but that there's another way. Then the external work of what just transition looks like in action, what we think is that it looks like many small initiatives, projects, mutual aid, new businesses, organizations that are founded and operated with the just transition principles at their core. And that means for Good Work Institute that we support the people who are launching and working on these projects by providing different types of training, by developing ways to share resources, so we can all benefit from a collaborative rather than a competitive approach. And we can connect to a network of mutual support. And I'll just throw out 4 examples that we have going on right now, which is we recently transitioned from a traditional nonprofit to a worker self-directed nonprofit, a shared leadership structure. So we're designing resources for helping others transition or designing for shared leadership. We have a fiscal sponsorship program. We're developing communities of practice, and we facilitate all kinds of convenings. So all to say that Just Transition in Action looks like a lot of things happening all over the region and within ourselves in service of manifesting just transition. And while each person or initiative might lean towards one of the 5 principles, the idea is that we actually need to take into account all 5, that all of these principles are interconnected, interdependent, and that our actions need to be in service of creating translocal, healthy, just systems by looking at what we're doing through the lens of those 5 principles. And just to give some examples, this can look like a cooperative farm project. It can look like a community finance fund, maybe reimagining how we keep our communities safe. We just had an example of that. Projects reconnecting us with nature, non-extractive media projects, learning how to garden, or figuring out a new way to make a living or contribute because what you're doing doesn't align anymore for you. So all of it is necessary. The change that we need is so massive, but rather than seeing it as this one monolithic effort, it is a wonderful explosion of a wide variety of the hope bomb going off. It's a huge diversity of efforts, and we all need to find our way towards the good work. Like, what is your good work?
Well done. I knew there was complementarity between all of these things, but the level of it is kind of making my mind just go bang. Melissa, some follow-up.
Yeah, and so you're teeing up the question that I was going to follow up with, which is just to invite each person on the panel to identify 1 or 2 things that are up in your mind around connections between your vision and those around you, and potential of those connections for alliances or collaboration or coalitions that that may occur to you. Why don't you hit and unmute all, Brian, or do you want to, should we unmute?
I think
as they flap their arms, go like this.
Mute themselves.
Well, I'll start. And this sort of was going with what Kwame was speaking about in terms of sort of people creating the conditions for their own safety and taking initiative and responsibility for that rather than relying on external patriarchal forces. But creating and inviting inclusive, safe feeling public realm is one of the ways of doing that. And it's again a collaborative process, but it's looking at how these pods, and I don't know if they're places or if they're tied to a facility or an institution, but I've seen some very interesting examples at a park, for example, in Paterson, New Jersey, where they had a community garden that no one went to because they were too afraid to be there, with a police Koban station that the police officers would sit there every so often. And this was a very stable neighborhood with legacy residents and a tremendous amount of crime, mostly drug-related crime. And so I'm looking at these investments. I'm looking at this wonderful park and this wonderful garden and this Koban station and thinking, like, why couldn't we sort of bring these things together where if there is a police presence, the Koban officer is there when the neighbors are doing their community gardening in the morning. and creating food and creating, building networks and creating more social cohesion and making that park safer, and then using that building to store, mulch and compost and all the gardening tools. And so why can't there be this triangularity between positive activity in an attractive public space in the center of a neighborhood that actually contributes to safety? So looking for some of these really kind of small scale sorts of changes can be helpful. Also in Patterson, when we were doing our crime prevention through environmental design, sort of smart growth, safe growth walkthrough. We saw, it was a business district, but the windows were all full of advertising and boxes, or they hadn't been cleaned. There were no displays. There was poor lighting. And we all decided to stop and have a conversation in front of one business. And we turned around, it was a barber shop with a huge plate glass window where everyone in our group could look in and wave at the people getting their haircut. And the people who were getting their haircut came out on the sidewalk to figure out what the heck we were doing. And it was visible. You could see in, you could see out. There was a connection between the business and the street. And it was just one shop owner who decided not to put, advertising in the windows, which made it safer because you could see in, you could see out, and it created that sort of immediate connection. So those are some small things that can happen, looking at the public space and the way that street fronts and parks are designed and how you co-locate uses together.
Cool. Okay, and what else? We are, of course, getting close to the end of this panel and discussion, but what else quickly is on panelists' mind, and then we'll see what questions are coming into the chat.
I can say one thing that is on my mind a lot, and when I hear about the other panelist projects in more depth, it just makes me think about the importance of having ways to get these stories out, because storytelling for social change is something that I really believe is the only way that people really change their mind or even see a new possibility when they themselves are sort of hitting a wall. And we're living in a time where storytelling is so dominated by emergencies and disasters and sort of dichotomization of any kind of potential public space in terms of ideas. And I feel very strongly that, for example, at Good Work Institute, I'm working on a project to illuminate the work that is out there that's actually positive. And it's not about being Pollyanna. It's about saying the old system is dying and a lot of people are suffering, but the new system is already being planted. There are already small seeds that are starting to grow, and we need to also focus on those things and not only put our attention on, what is clearly a tragedy for many people. So, I would invite everybody on the panel to maybe we can talk and we can have Good Work Institute or another media partner, actually get the stories out. I mean, obviously we just came out of this beautiful issue that Chronogram put together, but I think this type of work of getting the stories out in front of more people is so important.
Yeah, this can be ongoing. Should we have a couple more quick responses? And then there's a really beautiful question just popped up.
Well, I could potentially speak to the issue of collaboration while also engaging Ashley's, I think, important question.
You want to read the question when you get to it, just so that folks will know?
Oh,
just a little of it.
Just to kind of summarize it, the question is, people often feel overwhelmed by the size of these systemic issues, and they reach a wall, I think maybe as Hélène was referencing, where they ask the state to step in. And then asking for recommendations around the state stepping in. And I think that part of what I'm hearing from a number of the panelists, and I think particularly from Hélène, is that that moment where we hit a wall and we say, we can't actually do very much more, we need the state to step in, is precisely the moment to ask, wait, what's happening? What's happening for me that I feel a wall has been hit, because very likely there's not a physical wall there. And so there's actually a story that's happening internally, to reference stories, and if that story can leave the head and be exposed to air in some sort of a group situation, TMI is the TMI project, then it can be like, is it actually true that we've hit a wall, or is it true that I'm having to realize that maybe my vision for the public space, to tie in Cynthia, is different from someone else's, and I don't know how to handle that conflict. Like, for example, maybe the drug users just want to shoot up on the street and they don't care if it's productive for capital. And so then we haven't figured out how to resolve the question of whether the public space should be something that produces profit or is simply used by people, right? So there's those wall moments within, and that therefore, like, okay, the state will step in because the state has the job to decide what's legal and not legal. Problem solved, right? So I think that when we hit that wall, that's the time for storytelling and to figure out what's actually true about that moment of blockage.
Sweet. Other comments from the panelists or other questions in the chat?
Well, there is a question in the chat about what are ways to increase diversity in community gardens and increase participation. And I think that's a good question. I know here in Kingston, the Kingston Farm Project has tried very hard to work on this very issue. It's actually, the farm is about 100 yards from my office here. And the YMCA Farm Project here has really tried to engage the community who lives here in Midtown Kingston. I don't know of all the specifics of it, but I know that Scenic Hudson is also working on kind of micro farms in Poughkeepsie. And when you have these urban farms where people live, I certainly think that is one way to increase participation. But I'm certainly not an expert on this, but I encourage Larry to look into the Kingston YMCA Farm Project.
A comment. It's about like local food and what is local. So it depends on what you're growing. If you have a particular cultural population from a particular part of the world that wants to do gardening, and they're able to grow fruits and vegetables and foods that are indigenous, that they grew up eating, that are true to their culture, they might be more interested in gardening. They're not necessarily going to do heirloom tomatoes if that's not, you know, what they're used to eating. So if you look at the indigeneity, the opportunities for indigeneity of the food that's being produced, engaging people in growing food that they grew up with, that's part of their tradition, might be a way of encouraging them to continue. Just a thought.
Great. All right, well, I think there's some interesting comments in the chat, but this seems like a good spot to wrap up. So thanks everybody for coming out. You know, we're all on Zoom all the time, so I really appreciate everybody's participation. I know I feel the Zoom burn as much as anybody, so thanks. And so I like to keep it tidy so we can all go and not look at our screens and let our retinas refocus. We'll be reposting all of this on chronogram.com, and I think I'm hearing there's a possibility of more collaboration around this. So I'm going to follow up, and I'll send it out to the entire group of people who signed up for this thing today, and let's see if we can't have some action come from this that is collaborative and that takes our internal change and externalizes it in a local way. I mean,
yeah, and I would just piggyback that Sustainable Hudson Valley has been facilitating a bunch of smaller conversations in the same space and looking to do podcasts and webinars, and some collaborative projects are gelling. So count us in. Brian, you and I can follow up, but we can sort of see how to weave the web and figure out among everybody who's attended, like who we each know and
right,
how to connect with y'all.
Well, awesome. I feel really invigorated by this, and I'm going to go and leave here and drop some hope bombs on my way home. So thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Brian, can you save the chat for sure?
Yeah, for sure. We'll save the chat.
Sweet.